McGraw. I would first like to ask you to introduce yourself and how you got started in music and where you are today.
I'm an associate professor of music at the University of Richmond. I've been here since 2006. And how did I get into music? I was probably, well, when I was little, we would sing, little folk songs. And my grandmother would have me sing. And that was just part of family life. Singing poorly in the church sometimes. I'm from Kansas City and then went to school on the East Coast. And I started playing music. I started playing drums when I was, I guess, 13, because a friend of mine played guitar, and it was a way for us to socialize. It was a way for us to hang out. I think I probably started violin in elementary school, but then we moved. We moved a lot because my father was a journalist, so we moved. And I think that my nascent classical career was interrupted. But just started playing drums and then studied music and anthropology in college, and then went back home to Kansas City and was playing jazz and teaching music lessons and working in a music shop making drums. And I became really interested in kind of studying I guess you could say, the genealogy of the drum set, because it's described as this very American thing, but of course it's a cobbling together. In a way, it's a kind of metaphor for America. It's this kind of cobbling together of Turkish cymbals and Chinese tom-toms and European snares, which came from Africa. And it's this very kind of interesting cultural story. And at a certain point, there was someone who wanted to do someone in Singapore who wanted to do a house trade to come to Kansas City. And I took them up on that and went to Singapore, and because partly I didn't know anything about that part of the world, and was playing in an ensemble with a musician who said, oh, well, if you're going to be there, go to this place called Bali, because he had studied there and he'd left a drum there that he wanted me to pick up. And so that kind of started my interest on that particular musical culture, partly because its mode of organization, just musical organization, was so different and unique. And musically, I found it really compelling, but I found it just as compelling socially, because I, at that time, was spending a lot of my day in a practice room with a metronome, with dots on a page, trying to play faster and better. It was kind of alienating. And when I went to the conservatory in Bali, they didn't have any practice rooms. I was kind of like, well, how did you get so good? And their approach was like, well, why would you ever practice alone? I mean, the whole point of music is it's a means, it's an excuse to come together and hang out. And that was a kind of revolution, right? And as I studied more and more, I kind of came to understand how historically and culturally the music culture in which we have been raised is really a kind of outlier. It's kind of unusual as compared to music's role in a lot of other societies, and certainly historically.
It's really interesting. So by that you mean Western music, like classical, how we view it today?
Yeah, I mean classical, but also popular music. I mean, pretty much everything in the West, in America, that's not described as folk or sacred music.
Yeah, so this is just a quick side question. How does your international view of music, like how does Western music stack up to international music just in general? That is a very loaded question.
Well, it's tricky because it's hard to define Western music, and Western music has had the loudest megaphone in terms of its cultural influence and spread through mass media for the past century. I guess what I try to think of it in geological terms. When you go to a science museum, you always encounter those long timelines, right? The history of the earth. And it's always the case that, the last millimeter it says humans, right? Well, if you took that last millimeter and you expanded it out in terms of kind of music's history,
Right.
of course, it's all speculative, but we think that humans have been making music for about 1 million years. Now, modern humans aren't that old. They're something like 200,000 years old. But our line of hominins is about 1 million years old.
Right.
Musical instruments go back about 30,000, 40,000 years that have lasted, but certainly there were things that deteriorated, like drums, simpler instruments. And certainly before that, people were singing. So when people think that we may have been making music for about 1 million years, it's partly based on the anatomy of the vocal tract that changed substantially to allow us to make more sounds around that time. So if you took that 1 million years and you turned that into a timeline, then if every year, right, was a millimeter, you would have like 10 football fields, give or take. And only like the last third of a foot of the last football field would represent the way in which most of us experience music today, which is as a recording that is mass mediated, that we hear by ourselves on headphones, that we did not make ourselves. For the vast history of all humans, no matter where they lived, if they wanted to hear music, they had to make it themselves, or they had to support its production within the community directly. And so that legacy of a kind of more communitarian relationship to music, or a more live relationship to music, has lasted a bit longer in other parts of the world than it maybe has in the center of Western modernity and capitalism. And we still do it as well, right? So people are listening to YouTube, listening to Spotify, but a lot of people are still singing every Sunday or Saturday. They're still, they still have their garage bands. They still do these things. But I guess the point I'm making is our particular way of experiencing music today is really weird when considered in terms of the kind of the historical depth of music making.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about it like that, how what so many people think of almost as therapeutic is so new.
Yeah.
So I'd really love you to speak a little bit about Javanese and Balinese music, since I know that's your specialty, and what it represents and how it works. And is there I know there are different orchestrations, and there's some regions with more structure and some with working with what they have. So I'd love you to speak about that.
So it's a tradition. I mean, the term gamelan is a little bit vague. It's kind of used to refer to the traditional percussion orchestras of Java and Bali, which are just two islands of an archipelago nation state of about 17,000 islands, Indonesia, which is the fourth most populous nation in the world. It's about the size of Europe. Not a lot of Americans have a lot of historical or geographical understanding of it. So there's a lot of variation between those islands historically because they're separated by water. And so they just kind of culturally evolved to be more varied than, say, our mostly landlocked nation. And so it's primarily Central Java and Bali that people are talking about when they talk about those traditions. And there are both court forms and more kind of democratized or village forms of those. And one way in which they're organized, which might be different from, say, the classical Western symphony orchestra, is that the kind of entry slope, the kind of access is a lot flatter at the beginning. So really anybody can pick up a nice soft mallet and hit a gong and then wait for 8 beats or whatever the cycle length is going to be. And so a lot of people can enter those ensembles as really kind of complete beginners without any specialized, individualized training. And then from there, they can work on, if they want, to much harder parts with really sophisticated repertoire. That's not really possible in a lot of Western music ensembles, where you have to invest a lot of uh, resources into buying your own instrument. Typically, the Indonesians don't own their own instrument. It's a communal, it's thought of as one full instrument. You're only playing part of it, and it's owned by the community. And you don't have to invest in individualized lessons, typically, unless you get into the gnarlier parts and you want to really take it to the next level. Whereas if you want to enter even a community orchestra, you would better have a decent instrument, and you need to have years of lessons before you even show up. So that's different. And what that means is you can accommodate a community, a kind of random sampling of a community, much easier than you could with a Western orchestra or even a kind of garage band arrangement. And in any community, you find this wide range of abilities, aptitudes, interests, amount of time, and there's a way to accommodate most people in that kind of ensemble. It's kind of tailored around an average community. But at the same time, that doesn't restrict the expressiveness or the virtuosity or the kind of complexity of the tradition either. And that's something I've always found really appealing and different from the musical culture that I grew up in.
Okay, that's a really interesting way to think about how it's facilitated. I think I really like that more than how our music world is right now. So, when you listen to a song, what would you hear? What should you listen for? How do you listen to gamelan music?
Yeah, that's tricky, and it takes time, and it's like anything. If you don't have a way to get into it, it just sounds like noise. And of course, that's the same for the Western orchestra. For someone who has no training in it or no understanding of it, that's the same for any kind of visual representation, any kind of art. And the best way to understand any kind of art form or any kind of craft, cooking, masonry, bricklaying, is to try it yourself. And all it takes usually is one like really spectacular fail in the kitchen to then really appreciate more deeply your next experience at a good restaurant, right?
Right.
You can really understand how good the Richmond Symphony is if you have tried in some version some of those instruments, right? And it gives you this way to get into it. Well, if the level of access to your local musical culture is lower to just get in the door as it is for gamelan, then it really broadens the base of the population that can read it, that can listen to it in an informed way. And when I first went to Bali, I saw this competition between two groups. And it's very communitarian, but it's also very competitive between the groups. And there was an audience of about 5,000 people. And the audience was behaving the way an audience at like a European soccer match behaves, like really rowdy and really engaged. Like if there was a tiny, tiny mistake, the audiences went nuts. If the ensemble did something that I thought was incredibly subtle and sophisticated, like a slight unpredicted change in tempo and dynamics, the audience went nuts. They went nuts to like, you know, hearing a shredding heavy metal guitarist. And I thought, these people know exactly what's going on. That's different. There's a really, really broad base of understanding for this really high art as I was hearing it at the time. And so to be able to understand gamelan music, you need to sit in it. I mean, to really get it from that kind of insider's view, you need to sit at the gong and hit and wait 8 beats, and then maybe try some of the other parts to understand how to hear the interlocking, how to hear in Javanese music the improvisation, and how people can express themselves through really nuanced improvisation.
So I think gamelan music is very emphasized in percussion. So if that's correct. So is there any significance in the rhythms specifically? Because I know that's how African music generally works. So is there similarity there?
Well, it depends on which tradition you're talking about, right? They're all very different. So the Balinese, because they like really, really fast melodies, typically, the way the instruments work is you have to play with one hand with a hammer, but because they're very, very resonant, they're essentially bells. If you just hit them and let them ring, it becomes very indistinct. It becomes a mess. So you need to damp the key that you just played with the left hand when you go to the next key, which means that you can only play so fast. But if you want a melody to go, there's no way you're going to be able to do that by yourself. So what you do is you divide it into two. And you give half of the notes to one person and half of the notes to the other person. And then you have to decide what's an ergonomic, what's an artful way to divide those rhythms. And so the kind of complicated rhythms that emerge are a consequence often of trying to resolve melodic and orchestration issues. And rhythmically, they can be really, really exciting. A lot more exciting than it would be if a single player on a piano is just playing the same thing. Partly because you're getting this very complicated stereophonic effect of the melody jumping all around the room. And so it is rhythmic, but when a composer sits down, in my experience, what they're composing is a melody, not necessarily a rhythm. And the complicated rhythm is their response to how to set the melody, or to set the melody's elaboration. I think West African music, West African music that's lots and lots and lots and lots of different kinds of musics, only some of which are percussion and drum based. But I think those are often conceived of as melodically as well, even if they're not distinct pitches. So if the rhythm is kind of that is expressed through different kind of techniques on the drums. But I think often there is a melodic germ that is then realized through sometimes complicated, if need be, rhythmic realization.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting because I think in American music, we don't always, when we're listening, at least I know percussionists do think about it, but when we're listening, we don't necessarily think of drums as pitches. We just think of them as, like, that's not the first place your mind goes to. So I really think that's really interesting. Could you speak a little bit about the connection of gamelan and dance and that storytelling?
A lot of Balinese music is, what attracts me partly is that it's not only rhythmic in an interesting sense, but the tempos are not flat, if we mapped them, right, with kind of speed on the y-axis and time going left to right. A lot of the music, popular music, is very flat. Symphonic music can flow, certainly solo piano pieces, there's a lot of rubato, because you don't have to coordinate between people. But in gamelan, you have 30 people playing really, really complicated interlocking rhythms, and the tempos are very, very fluid. Sudden speed up and slow down. Often that's a response to what the dancer is doing. So if the dancer is speeding up or slowing down, the music accompanying them has to do that. And then in cases where it's purely instrumental, those gestures are still retained. So there can be as much kind of temporal and dynamic composition and tension and release and development as there is melodic or rhythmic development. And that's a bit different from the Western tradition, where it's sometimes the case that melody, harmony are primary, and they're the composition, and the kind of tempo and dynamics, if there's any variability, are kind of dealt with after the fact as part of our own oral tradition in rehearsal. Whereas for a lot of Balinese folks, and certainly the Javanese and the way they construct time, that's part of the composition.
Yeah, I think it's really, I really like the idea of unifying art forms that way and making it more fluid, like you said. I think that shows more, it just is more involved music rather, and there's nothing wrong with scored music or anything, but I think it's just a really cool way to get involved with that community. But you spoke a little bit about the exotification of Balinese music, and I was wondering if you could talk about what that means and how we need to be looking at this form of music.
Yeah, so Indonesia is a post-colonial country. They're colonized first by the Portuguese, and then the Dutch, and then the English for a little bit, then the Dutch again, and then the Japanese, and then they gained independence in 45, which wasn't recognized internationally until 49. And there's a real complicated history of that colonial legacy of oppression and of resource extraction. Both literal materials out of the country, but in extracting in an oppressive way the labor of Indonesians. And so when their representations flow globally, we need to be careful of the misuse, potentially, of their culture. And we need to think about who's representing it and who has the rights to represent it. And obviously, part of what I do is to represent, is to teach and to share Indonesian culture. In a way, social media has helped us with that, and Indonesia is the second largest Facebook community after America. So whereas in previous generations you might teach gamelan, and if you made mistakes you might get away with it, if we do a performance or even a rehearsal and everyone has their cell phones and it's posted on Facebook and I did something wrong, within 8 hours, several friends have let me know what mistakes I have made and have helpfully showed me how to correct them. So that's good, and that helps us potentially check ourselves if and when non-Balinese are making mistakes in representing their culture. Bali has served as a kind of romantic object for anthropology and for tourism and for ethnomusicology for a long time. And so it's important to kind of always have our ears pricked up, ready to detect potential exotification. The flip side of it is that it's not the case that only Western modern music should be able to claim a kind of universality, or should be able to suggest that it speaks to the universal in humanity, which is often how it represents itself. The Ode to Joy, Beethoven, as somehow expressing a deep human need for expression and freedom. Well, the Ode to Joy is a German expression of a particular time and place that's very different from any of the world that any of us are living in, right? And I remember one of my Javanese teachers, my dissertation advisor at Wesleyan, kind of arguing back, like, well, if Western modern music gets to make that claim, that there's something in this music, it's so beautiful that there's something everyone would benefit from studying, why can't gamelan also be appreciated as something that can provide a unique contribution to humanity, right? Even if those people are not Indonesian, Balinese, or Javanese. So it's hard to keep those two things in balance, right? We don't want to exotify and misrepresent, and yet I think it's true that every culture produces something, probably many things, that are valuable and worth studying cross-culturally. And so how do we do the one without falling into the other? It's something we always have to be aware of, especially when there is a power differential, right? When we're talking about someone at a university with a lot of money who has job security representing the music of many performers who have far less money and not the same kind of job security that I do. And that's in those cases especially, we need to be careful. But it's not the case, I don't think, I've never come across any universal blanket definition of what appropriation and exotification would be in all cases. So that if we just followed these rules, we would be safe and we would be ethically immune in all cases. I just don't think that's the way appropriation and representation work, because I think it depends on the context, and the context is always changing. So the context of representation, misrepresentation for African and African American culture is different for someone like me living in America right now with the history of race relations in America than it would be potentially for my engagement with Greek music or Irish American music. There are still issues, but those issues are going to be different because the context is different in every one of those cases.
Yeah, I think that's really important. All of those things are so important to keep in mind, especially today in this cultural revolution we're having. And now that the world has become so much tighter knit with technology, as you mentioned with Facebook, I was speaking with Dr. Terry Austin, and he said something very similar, that even though, for example, he works in Japan a lot, and he said, even though people in Japan appreciate Western music and they can listen to it and say, wow, that's beautiful, it's not going to have the same emotional significance that their own music, their original traditional music will have to them. And I think that's something that everyone needs to keep in mind, is we all have different emotionally significant music. So I really like that point. And I think that's a good segue into my next question. You've done a lot of work on ethics and music. So if you could maybe expand on the role of staying morally sound while appreciating and spreading music, the love for music, and that might be very similar to your answer. So if you want to move on to a different question, that's all right.
When I think about ethics and music, I'm thinking about the ways in which we might learn how to be ethical with one another through the kinds of modes of interaction that we engage in when we are musicians. How do we listen to someone else? How do we imagine how we sound to them, right? How do we imagine how our interaction sounds to the audience? There are all of these modes in which we have to place ourselves in different perspectives to be successful musicians, right? We need a different viewpoint on the interaction. I think that can serve in a really useful metaphorical way for how we can behave ethically to one another in a broader social context. If we imagine, I'm not playing that instrument right now, or I'm not doing that thing right now, but I might be the next time, it might help us think about, like, well, I'm not having a hard time right now, but that could be me next year. So how should I behave, knowing that I could be anywhere in this society? That's not exactly how we set up our particular society, but that's a theory of, say, Rawls' theory of justice. Imagine creating a society in which you wouldn't know where you would end up. What kind of society would you want? I also think about it in terms of distribution. So if we think back to that kind of geological perspective, there are good reasons to think that music has been important historically. Otherwise, it would have evolved out. It would have left, right? It wouldn't confer any kind of adaptive advantage on our ancestors. So there's some reason it's still around. Every culture engages with something that we could call music, even if they argue about how to define music. And as far as we can tell, that's been the case historically. So that seems to suggest that in order to kind of fully flourish as a human, you should be accorded the rights to express and enjoy music, even if you're deaf, because music can be something that's beyond simply cochlear hearing through the ear. We experience music as a vibration. We experience it as interaction between other people, patty cake, right? And so when the resources for expressing oneself and engaging in music are not evenly spread through society, I think that's a problem. And I think all we need to look to is, say, the disproportionate funding for arts in public school systems versus private versus public universities to see that it is not equal. And I think that is unethical, and I think there are good reasons to try to make access to music as broad as possible. And I think there are other cultures we can look to as exemplars on that, and Indonesia is one of them.
That's such an amazing answer and a great way to end this interview. I completely agree with everything you're saying. Thank you so much for meeting with me. I thought that this would kind of satisfy my questions, but I have so many more questions.
Well, you can email more questions. I'm sorry I've got to go, and I'd be happy to respond to them.
I'm just really glad I had this opportunity. Like I said in my email, seeing your group perform really changed the way that I think about performance and with my instrument. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Well, good. Come by anytime. We're not allowed on campus right now because we're in red stage. But hopefully, maybe by the summer, we'll be rehearsing here again. And again, it's free and it's open to everyone. So come and check it out sometime.
I would love to. Yeah, I'll definitely look out for that.
Okay.
Keep you any longer. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good luck.
Thank you so much for watching this video. It means the world to me that more people want to become involved in the music community and learn more about music. There is so much more to come, and I'm so excited to share it with you all. So please follow this capstone on Instagram and check out my website. You can find more updates to come there. Also interact with the material, start a conversation in the comments, or send me a question directly in the link I provided in the description. I hope you learned something. Stay tuned.